is Chris Sheehy, and I am a research and policy manager with the Global Network Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder group of academics, information and communications technology companies, digital rights and press freedom groups, and investors. And we collaborate in support of freedom of expression, privacy in the ICT sector. Today, the Action Coalition on Meaningful Transparency is really grateful to be able to host today's session, Bridging Barriers to Meaningful Transparency, and to help commemorate World Press Freedom Day. UNESCO's leadership on this topic is as urgent as ever as journalists face growing and increasingly sophisticated threats to their work and safety in the digital age. And I would like to move to today's theme of digital transparency. As we all know, with the integral role that digital communications technologies have come to play in our day-to-day lives, there's a clear need to better understand how these technologies operate, and relatedly, how companies and governments collect and use the data that these technologies generate. There is a need for a clear and candid exploration of the barriers that need to be overcome to achieve these aims for more meaningful transparency as well. In GNI's work surveying global content regulation efforts around the world, we've also seen a growing number of proposals that feature specific requirements for digital transparency that provide important context for this work. Recognizing this, earlier this year, we announced the launch of the Action Coalition on Meaningful Transparency, which we'll refer to as the ACT. And this was launched under the auspices of the Danish Tech for Democracy initiative. The ACT aims to identify and build connections and collaborations between a wide range of academics, civil society organizations, companies, governments, and international organizations, all working on interconnected transparency initiatives. This includes efforts focused on company transparency reporting, government laws that encourage or restrict transparency, enhanced researcher access to data, and algorithmic transparency, among other topics. So today we're delighted to share some more about some of our goals for this initiative and some of the challenges and opportunities we expect to face in this work. The ACT is led by a global steering group of civil society organizations, including some of my colleagues on this panel. And we are currently reaching out to potential participants to take part in the broader coalition. So we encourage any interested stakeholders to reach out if they would like to take part. Finally, I would like to briefly introduce the panel today. I'm grateful to be joined by Curtis Barnes, who's the project lead for the GNI Action Coalition, for the Action Coalition on Meaningful Transparency, and he's a director at Brainbox. Next, we'll have Nicolo Zingales, who's a professor at FGV Law School in Rio de Janeiro, as well as at the Center for Technology and Society at FGV. We'll then follow with Alicia Wanless, who's a director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And finally, we will close with Christina Kirk, who's the principal advisor to the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet in New Zealand. Our colleagues at the Denmark Ministry of Foreign Affairs were unable to join and send apologies. We'll speak a little bit more about speakers' work and organizations throughout the discussion, but Curtis, first I'd like to go to you first to help us get started. So as the project lead on the ACT, you and Brainbox will play an important role in driving forward multi-stakeholder collaboration on these topics. And part of this work includes surveying the wide-ranging landscape of actors that are working on meaningful digital transparency. And this project adds to your wealth of experience already working with regulators and researchers alike on platform regulation, content moderation, and AI and other emerging technologies, among other issues. It would be great to hear a little bit about, from your experiences, what some of the common approaches you have seen to addressing concerns about insufficient transparency. What are some of the core gaps in understanding, and how can the ACT work to amplify and refine the most effective approaches while avoiding duplication of effort? So with that, I would like to turn to Curtis.
Thank you very much, Chris, for setting the stage on the ACT. I'll add to that as I can, proceeding through this talk. But I first wanted to preface a little bit about my background, only because I think it's useful to understanding why it's so important to have an entity like the ACT getting up to speed at this point in time, and why it has the potential to be so impactful, in my opinion. My background and the background of the people involved at Brainbox is in law and internet governance and emerging tech and AI. And as you've pointed out, we've worked on both sides of the stakeholder aisle, although there are many stakeholders relevant to this area. But there's government, there's tech, there's academia, and of course, the press occupy a very special role in this relationship. My reflection upon the work that we have done is that transparency-focused approaches have been a very recurring theme and a recurring conclusion. And I hope to preface a few examples of that through previous work that we've been involved with. So for example, in 2020, we were brought in by a global investor coalition after the 15th of March Christchurch attacks to conduct an analysis on whether or not Facebook, Twitter, and Google were capable of preventing similar objectionable content crises from occurring in the future, or at the very least mitigating them. And in the course of that, it became very clear that not only was transparency an issue in answering this question meaningfully for the investors and who had a serious stake in the outcome, but also that transparency was part of the major solution to ensuring that whatever measures put in place for content moderation by the companies would be effective in the long run. Later, we actually moved into working for the ESG space, who were interested in whether or not it was in accordance with the UN principles on business and investment that you could continue to invest in these companies given their lack of transparency in some regards, and given the risks that regulation would come in and cause them to divulge information, which may be a serious risk to human rights in a number of ways. And later, of course, I think one of the more interesting recent examples of the work that's going on in this area is the Global Partnership on AI, who Brainbox helped with their Responsible AI Working Group as it attempts to embed researchers and build a partnership with tech where they can get inside and conduct monitoring exercises of the recommender systems and whether or not they have a relationship that's observable between the consumption of terrorist and violent extremist content. That's among the more cutting edge, in my opinion, multi-stakeholder voluntary efforts to try and steer transparency towards a fruitful conclusion or a fruitful level of progress in this area. I think ultimately transparency is important at this point for very simple reasons. It's a straightforward governance principle that if you improve the visibility of the actors in the space, you're going to improve conduct, you're going to have an empirical basis for further regulatory interventions. And I think that's extremely important at this particular moment in time when regulation is really starting to pick up speed. But of course, where the ICT space is somewhat different to some of the other areas where transparency approaches have been employed, it has very distinct human rights concerns and risks around the exposure of information, rights of expression, rights of information, association, and privacy, of course, and the boundaries of where this could and should be divulged to states in an either voluntary or mandatory way. I think all the broad stakeholders involved perceive these risks, and that is both a value and a challenge because they don't trust each other. And that makes it hard to bring everybody to the table in the way that needs to be done, because each of the stakeholders is in the best position to know what they need from the others and also why they can't give them what they're asking for. So accessing these insights is a real imperative and part of why the Act can play such an important role, synthesizing them and getting everyone to the table and ensuring that the recommendations that emerge are enduring and actually implementable and operationalizable. To sum up on, I think, challenges and solutions, there's a passage from a report by the Institute for Strategic Dialogue where they talk about the risks and expectations associated with transparency being poorly articulated, and often they're lacking specificity or they're varying across platforms or different jurisdictions. But there are a number of promising frameworks and models out there that exist, and bringing them together, bringing a wider ecosystem together to produce durable recommendations is really where I think the Act is going to make a substantial contribution. there's complexity, there's challenges around specificity and what you're asking for versus transferability across different companies and different governments. And then there's this challenge that the ongoing work, which is enormous, is very siloed. And so the Act hopes to pull it all together. And that's why I think that the Act is coming at a watershed moment with this pressing need to coordinate and collate the ongoing efforts into a durable arrangement of recommendations and outcomes. Much of the global regulation that I'm observing essentially leaves the details up to delegated legislation at a later date, and that's going to take a consultation process to implement. And I think that the Act can actually get a head start on that and possibly do it better than will occur if done by government. My final word on the whole matter would be that it's a great responsibility to be leading as the project lead. Of course, I'm reluctant to say leading because there are so many eminent individuals who are part of the concentric circles that make up the Act. And we're also not looking for just the voices, the typical voices you'd hear in this space. We want to get a global community involved to build up momentum and ensure that whatever recommendations are produced come from a knitted global community with diverse perspectives and from diverse stakeholder backgrounds. Ultimately, I'm looking forward to hearing the other panelists, but perhaps most of all, the audience, and hope to engage with you now and over the next 12 months. And of course, if you're interested in this space, you're absolutely encouraged to reach out and become a member of the Act. And if you feel that you're already doing work in this area that is valuable, there's every chance we'll be reaching out to you anyway.
Thanks so much for the great remarks, Curtis. I think they really helpfully set the stage on the different competing interests that might come up, but also the importance of making sure that all of these ongoing, in particular, multi-stakeholder efforts to set norms in this space are reflected and valued in the myriad regulatory conversations that are ongoing at the same time. So thank you for that. And I think moving on to a little bit more context on some of what's going on in the regulatory space, I would like to next turn to Alicia. So Alicia, in your work leading the Partnership on Countering Influence Operations, you have extensive experience researching potential abuses of digital platforms on one hand. We've also worked to document the many different regulatory proposals, expert recommendations, and other initiatives that are striving to address the need for better access to information on these abuses. And I know that that's included a particular focus in mapping and documenting some of both transparency reporting requirements and data sharing requirements and norms put forth. So I would love to hear a little bit on some of the major hurdles you've seen in making more progress on this necessary access to information for researchers and general public alike. And I would also like to hear there's particular models that you found to be useful and how the Act can be a valuable contributor in bridging these barriers or otherwise modeling good practices. So with that, I'll turn to you, Alicia.
Thanks, Chris. I think the first hurdle that we need to clear is to understand if we're actually speaking the same language. Transparency reporting means many things to many different people. For some, it means government reporting on things like the requests they have for having content removed by social media and why they ask for that. This really comes from a more traditional approach, similar to reporting on wiretapping. For others, it's about tech companies, such as social media platforms, reporting on their operations, providing verifiable explanations of what data they collect, how it's used, but also the policies they develop. How are those developed and how are they enforced, among other categories. In many of the conversations we've had, it's also clear that there's often a conflation between transparency reporting and data sharing. I would argue that transparency reporting, or what might be better termed as operational reporting, is aggregated information by online services about aspects of their operations, published on a regular and consistent basis. So operational reporting may be aimed at increasing transparency about their services, and auditing and impact assessment could then help in the verification process to make sure that the information that's being provided is accurate. Now, that kind of operational reporting could really give us insights into what data exists for research purposes, but also provide policymakers insights into how they should be developing regulation to be able to govern these companies. Whereas data sharing, or what might be better termed as data access, is distinct from transparency or operational reporting. Data access itself has two components. There's the data sharing by online services, and this refers to the provision of various types of raw data to external entities like researchers that companies provide. That data can be made available through APIs or directly through data sets. But the point here is that researchers can really dig in and look at that data themselves and make sense of it. The other aspect of data access is data acquisition, and this is more what's happening now, and that's collecting data through other means. This can include data donation by users, gathering public available information like through scraping, but also third-party service providers who seem to have more access to data that can then be put into the hands of researchers. I think this second major hurdle after data access is that we currently also lack rules for governing data sharing with researchers. And this lack of rules, these gaps, they leave a balance of power in terms of data sharing firmly in the hands of platforms, with researchers often not even understanding what data to ask for. So operational reporting, again, could first help clarify, but then we need to move on to data access with rules around what data should be given to what types of researchers for what purposes and how that process will be governed to protect the end users. So I think one of the models we could draw on to develop these processes is looking at how sensitive health data is shared for research purposes. And given that so much of the research around the information environment is focused on how it shapes people's beliefs and behaviors, there seems to be solid relevance from looking to the health sector to build that out. I think that an international coalition like the ACT could really help work out details on things like operational reporting, data access, and rules for data sharing, and in such a way that countries then could adopt broadly harmonized rules and legislation, which would speed up the overall process and also set up a situation by which the companies really can't refuse. If everybody agrees that this is the way that we should be going about it, this is the type of data that should be shared, and here are the rules around it, I don't see how tech companies can then work to circumvent that.
Thanks so much, Alicia. I really like the way you've sort of broken down the nuts and bolts of the operational reporting and the sort of broader data sharing component. And I think that one area of value we hope to add as the ACT is to really to be able to hone in on some of those extremely difficult questions and to put guidance out that comes from a place of respecting different perspectives and understanding the different barriers that the different players face to digital transparency and really work on some of the international guidance that it sounds like you're expressing is needed and get the backing of different stakeholders who are affected to help improve the adoption of such framework. It also gets a little bit at some of the trade-offs in different regulatory design on both the sort of operational reporting piece and the data sharing piece. And with that, I would like to turn to Nicolo. So Nicolo, you've done a lot of work comparing different models for internet governance, looking at the different and appropriate roles and responsibilities of intermediaries and government actors on issues ranging from content regulation to data protection. And I think as we've discussed some already, a growing number of regulatory proposals are putting together specific requirements in these different areas of company transparency and data sharing, as Alicia laid out. So when examining the different regulatory approaches, are there any lessons you would want to share for maximizing meaningful transparency while avoiding potential regulatory pitfalls? What are some of the trade-offs, the key considerations? I think in particular area to look into might be what enforcement looks like in practice, and including transparency and accountability for those bodies themselves who are tasked with oversight. So with that, I'll give Nicolo the floor.
Thank you, Chris. So yes, I just want to speak to some of the discussion that we've been having in the ACT, and in particular some of the discussion I had with Curtis, who is the lead of this project, and he has done a wonderful mapping of all the transparency initiatives. So I think three trends that we have been seeing with regard to transparency are, first of all, more attention to the local context. So whereas previously transparency reporting included a bunch of aggregate information with regard to how the platforms manage their algorithm and their moderators, now increasingly we have been seeing an attention into how the local staff is trained, what are their demographics, and characteristics that imply more attentiveness to the local context. So that's the first important trend. The second trend is the need to look much more into the automated decisions and recognize that these are complex socio-technical systems, and it's not enough to simply provide an open access version of the algorithm, as was suggested recently by, for example, Elon Musk with regard to Twitter, but you need continuous engagement and interrogation of the practices in these companies. And in particular, also understand what are the differential impacts that AI system can have on the population with regard to content moderation. But I think the third most interesting and most challenging area that we should all be paying attention to is what you mentioned earlier, the provisions that in several legislation would grant researchers access to platform data to understand the systemic risks involved, the spread of misinformation, and a number of issues that are of concern to society. So in this regards, we can mention, for example, the Digital Service Act, at least 3 bills in the United States, and in the country where I'm operating, Brazil, we have the law on transparency responsibility that also has a provision in this sense. So here the discussion is very much on how we define the obligations, who is entitled to have access, what we define as a researcher, for example, and here mainly the idea is to give access to researchers that are affiliated with academic institutions, that do not have commercial interest, and with regard to content, what kind of data do we want to give access to? So the idea of making ad libraries available for consultation in the public is a central aspect of some of this legislation, but also give more visibility to what kind of content is most popular, and more generally, any kind of information that is useful to understand how content moderation is done and what its impact are. And here the problem is, how do we limit that in a way that does not imply the revelation of trade secrets, or that leads to an uniformization of market practices, so that it basically limits competition because everybody would follow the same parameters for content moderation. So here, I think that this presents some important challenges, both from a competition perspective, but also from a privacy perspective, obviously. How this legislation is aiming to tackle this is still not clear, because this legislation is mainly referring to some further regulation or delegated acts that can be implemented by the Federal Trade Commission or the European Commission, for example, with regard to how the data needs to be made available and for whom. How do you verify the researchers? If you remember Cambridge Analytica, which is probably one of the biggest privacy scandals, it was triggered by a researcher, Alexander Kogan, which was affiliated with Cambridge University. He actually developed a commercial application on the basis of the research that was conducted for academic purposes. So how do you prevent this kind of contamination, let's say, of the purity of the accountability that we are looking for? So I think that society needs to ask these questions. What kind of accountability we are looking for? How do we make sure that access is given to people who can be trusted with what they're doing? So this, I think, it's a new type of transparency that needs to be thoroughly discussed. What are the possible solutions? I think that, as Alicia mentioned, we can look into other areas that previously dealt with the tensions between sharing data and preserving privacy confidentiality. Open data is one of these areas. So open government data usually follow the matrix of actions that need to be taken by governments when releasing certain data. So the more the data is sensitive, the more you need to provide access in a secure, enclaved space without transferring this data to the researchers. And maybe if you go into more aggregate, less sensitive type of data, you can either provide access through an API or simply provide confidentiality based access. So access with an agreement with the researchers that they will need to comply with strict confidentiality obligation, and they could be subject to sanctions in case they do not respect these obligations. In terms of competition, I think that we need to recognize that in certain contexts, more transparency does not necessarily bring public good, so it could lead to uniformization. But on the other hand, in many of these markets, what we are facing is some kind of, instead of an oligopoly, which is a context where typically more transparency creates more collusion, we have a confusopoly, so people do not really understand how to compare the practices of one company with those of another, and so this would bring arguably more competition and more switching between one provider and the other. And in terms of how we provide access, I think it's quite important to recognize that there are institutions that can serve this purpose of vouching the researchers who have access, ensuring that they respect the obligations. So what we need to make sure is that we create a new type of intermediary, a new type of institution that guarantees this trust and confidentiality. So I think a lot that remains to be done is on that front. How do we create these institutions? What kind of composition do we want to give to these institutions? Who watches the watchers themselves? And in that respect, I think that Brazil has an interesting model. Was also discussed this morning by Virgilio Almeida, which was previously the head of the Brazilian Steering Committee. It's a completely multi-stakeholder body that includes different parts of society. And what we need to make sure is that these institutions do not have merely a formal equality of representation of different branches of society, but really a substantive ability of the different groups to influence and participate in the decisions over how these policies are being made. So I guess this leaves with a lot of questions, and I think there's a lot of work for academics like me to do in the next years. And there, as I said also at the beginning, it's not just a matter of one-off release of data and forget, but it's a matter of continuous engagement, continuous dialogue with these socio-technical systems. And so the last provision that I think is interesting to mention in all these transparency initiatives is the safe harbor for independent researchers. So a lot of researchers and also journalists are interrogating the systems of these companies, experimenting, trying to understand how they work, and their accounts are being blocked, or they cannot get the data from other users who are willing to give them access to their data in order to understand how their policy work. So I think this safe harbor for independent research and experimentation with the platforms will be also something important to look at in the future. That's it on my end.
Thanks so much, Nicolo. I think you've done a really great job in breaking down what we're well aware as the organizers of the Act is a very broad set of potentially issues that can fall under the meaningful transparency, and honed in on some of the concrete touch points that we as a group and in aligning other initiatives can focus in on to ensure that we're providing effective guidance. And I think another theme we've seen so far is while regulation is emerging, there's still a lot that's needs to be put pen to paper later on, and a lot of proof in the pudding that we need to work in providing guidance for how some of these oversight bodies and other enforcement mechanisms will operate in practice. So thank you very much for that intervention. One thing I did want to note as well before we move on to the next speaker is if you are participating via the virtual portal, we do welcome questions, and there will be an opportunity for questions after our last speaker. So please do feel free to share some of those directly. So moving on to Christina. Christina, I understand that improving meaningful transparency has also been a component of various efforts led by the government of New Zealand to address concerns about misuse of digital platforms. whether that's spelling out specific commitments for companies and governments on transparency in the context of the Christchurch Call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online, or some of the other international initiatives that the government's taken a leading role on that you will speak to. Can you speak a little bit on why these particular issues of transparency around data use and content restrictions are so important to the government of New Zealand, and what some of the key goals are in this area looking ahead from your perspective, as well as how the Act can support and amplify your work?
Sure, thanks, Chris. First, I'd just like to say that it's a real pleasure to be here marking World Press Freedom Day and talking alongside the other experts on the importance of transparency in the digital realm. I think as democratic societies and market economies, we all, whether we're governments or in companies or in civil society or research and academia, we have a huge stake in helping to create a safe and inclusive information environment. And I think the basic building blocks of that are public education, public good broadcasting, support for free independent media. They all play an important role. And we all recognize that the arrival of a sort of borderless digital world has been hugely enabling for people all around the world in terms of providing unrivaled access to information and opinion. But it's also brought some unique and urgent challenges, and together we need to grip those up really quickly. And as governments, we can't just sit back and look at how things pan out over the medium to long term. We have to sort of act now as nimbly as we can to keep up with the developments and to protect the interests of our citizens and residents. I want to just take the example of disinformation campaigns because, you know, they have had particular impacts around the world recently, and they really hit at the underlying vulnerabilities of a society, the displaced people, those who are underserved, and people who already distrust governments and other authority figures, often for very good reasons. Now, there's a lot that we can do as governments to reduce the demand side, I guess, for disinformation. And that would be around more inclusive social and economic policies, better education curricula that address critical thinking skills and media literacy, supporting more effective communication and addressing historical injustices, and also being more transparent as governments about what we do and don't do in the information space. But there's also the supply side, and regulating harmful and disruptive systems, behaviors, including disinformation campaigns in the digital environment, is really hard in a context where we're trying to maintain the advantages of an open and globally connected internet, and where human rights laws place really important constraints on what we can do as governments in intervening. So this is where we see the most value from global multi-stakeholder approaches. And I can't speak in as much depth as the original speaker from the Danish Tech Ambassador's Office would have done about the Denmark's Tech for Democracy initiative. But we see that initiative alongside other complementary approaches, such as the Freedom Online Coalition, as really important parts of the response to how governments can work together with each other and with other sectors to address these kinds of issues that we can't and we shouldn't be trying to address alone. And the Christchurch Call is another helpful example of a global multi-stakeholder initiative in this space. As many people will know, it was launched soon after the horrific Christchurch terrorist attack in March 2019 by the Prime Minister of New Zealand and the President of France. And it's a set of commitments by governments and companies to work together in a multi-stakeholder way with civil society and academia to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online while protecting human rights and a free, open and secure internet. And transparency is woven throughout the core commitments. And that's because it's well recognized that meaningful transparency is necessary for building the trust and understanding among the different stakeholders about the problems we're trying to address, designing effective interventions, and then assessing the effectiveness of those interventions after they've been running a while, seeing the potential trade-offs in our responses, and identifying unintended consequences, trying to prevent those, or where we've had negative impacts on third parties, remedying those. And it's also, you know, just really a basic condition for each of the sectors involved in these in this work to be able to come together and really contribute their unique skills and perspectives. So the core community is really focused on how governments and companies can provide meaningful transparency around how we're delivering our core commitments. Here in the New Zealand government, we have just put out our first transparency report on how we are responding to digital violent extremism. And that's an important milestone for us. And we welcome any feedback on that report to help us improve it over time. I think we can all agree that we want to avoid compliance exercises. And as Nicolo spoke to, just publishing the code for AI or algorithms doesn't actually help anyone understand what happened to their tweet, because even the programmers who created the algorithm often won't know why it behaves in a certain way when it interacts with the user environment and other algorithms. That's why it becomes so important to look at smart ways of engaging impacted communities and understanding the harms they're experiencing, and how to tweak the policies or the AI or ML systems which help or hinder that over time. And researchers can really help in that. And Nicolo spoke to that, as did Curtis when he mentioned the sort of innovative researcher approaches in the GP. There's so much really great thinking and researching happening across the different sectors and forums on how to do transparency more meaningfully. And I think it's hugely valuable as a first step to have the Act bringing the players together and collating the current state of collective knowledge and thinking in one place to make it more easily accessible for all of us as governments and companies as we're trying to improve our practice in this space. And then to have those really hard conversations about what the real barriers are and how we can collectively overcome them is going to be hugely valuable for us all. And I hope that as the Act and as the Christchurch Call, we can usefully cross-fertilise one another's work. I think the trick to really effective multi-stakeholder approaches is to make sure that they deliver real results and effective change, and that pushes everyone's limits. It exposes some of the inherent asymmetries in information, resources, capability, but it also enables us to bring all our unique perspectives and skills and experiences to bear. So hopefully over time we build trust and more engagement and better results and create a virtuous circle. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Christina. I think you've laid out a very admirable goal for all of us working in this space to ensure we are aligning these efforts toward these really important goals of improving transparency around digital content and conduct, and much appreciated. We would like to open the floor to Q&A, but have not received, to my knowledge, any questions from the virtual audience. And so, Nicolo, I wasn't sure if there was anybody in person who wanted a chance to speak, and if not, I'd be happy to raise a couple additional questions to the panel.
Don't see anyone right now.
Great. So I think one theme that I've taken away from today, and that I know we've talked about a little bit, Alicia, I really like the breakdown between the sort of operational transparency and the broader, the sort of next level data access piece. And I think one complaint you hear from researchers that are working on these issues is in trying to design the ideal transparency reporting requirement or ideal set of information that researchers and other stakeholders need to know, you actually need to know a little bit more about what you are measuring beforehand. So I think that that's one area that I would be curious to hear a little bit more from really anyone on the panel on is, given the considerations we've already discussed that go into different questions around researcher access regimes, privacy considerations, competition questions, et cetera, how do we bridge this gap between the need to know what we are measuring and calling for what those transparency requirements might look like? Is it a matter of candid conversations in the interim, multi-stakeholder fora like the ACT? And I would really welcome anybody to respond to that question.
I'm happy to jump in. What you're talking about reminds me very much of the experience that GPI has had as part of its responsible AI working group. And Brainbox's role, my role in that was trying to forecast the likely challenges and there'd be legal challenges, policy challenges, and a whole host of others that would stand in the way of a meaningful partnership between GPI and the tech companies they hope to work with. And unfortunately, my role was sort of to be a bit of a wet blanket and keep posing, you're making an assumption here about what or why you are justified in asking for anything. And what came back was obviously, but this is the problem. It's a circular thing, is that we have a sense that we need to access things, or we are going on, well, we're informed by things like whistleblowers and others, but we really need to get a little bit of access to some evidence so that we can justify the larger case for more evidence. I don't think there's an easy way forward here. There's really two options. There's either the parties come meaningfully to the table and keep pushing through all the low trust and the challenges that they keep throwing back at each other about why I can't do what you're asking, or why we expect a little bit more for you. Either they make a breakthrough there in the negotiations through enhanced goodwill, or regulators are going to decide it for them. And the problem is that we're hoping to get ahead of that and offer insights that will inform regulation in a way that makes it proportionate and justifiable in accordance with human rights principles. So there is an element of give and take that needs to take place. And it is an ongoing process, but there's some urgency now that regulation is really starting to get locomotive.
I'm happy to jump in, Chris, if you like. I think, first of all, there is good measurement research that is being conducted. The problem right now, beyond data access and knowing what's available, is that most of these things are piecemeal and they're building their own data pipelines to be able to do it. So right now, we don't really have shared engineering infrastructure or scientific infrastructure to really speed up research, or even be able to have kind of a baseline of what are representative samples across social media. So I do think there's an aspect of the research community that could come together along with governments to build something like the equivalent of a CERN for the information environment that could really accelerate research in this space. Now, setting that aside and trying to get to the bottom of what the companies are actually doing, Heidi Twork and I outlined about 8 different categories of transparency or operational reporting that could be dug into already. I think the thing is we should prioritize, and we could do that as a multi-stakeholder community to understand what should really happen first. So the first category would be the user level. So who are using the platform? How are they using it? This would include things like demographics, languages that are spoken, where are they spoken, to give us a better understanding of really who's on the platforms and what they're doing. The second level would be the platform level. So how does it actually operate? What do the algorithms actually do? What different types of algorithms are there? I mean, we really have very little understanding there. The third is policy development. So how are they developing policies? How are they enforced? Who are the people behind them that are doing them? Do they actually have people who speak local languages or understand to be able to implement them? A fourth is content moderation. How do they set the rules for that? How do they enforce it? Who are the people who are actually responsible for doing it? Do they measure the impact of these things? And if so, what have they found? And leading on to that, internal research. What kind of things are they doing? We're really reliant on recent leaks here, but we probably shouldn't be. Can we create an environment where companies can actually share what they're finding in terms of the effects on their platform? A sixth category would be external requests, and that can be broken into two different types. So one is requests for interventions. Who's making requests for interventions? Why? How are they happening? And what's the decision-making process behind that? And who's requesting access to data? And this could be based, again, on a variety of different types of actors, be it government or researchers. Are they getting access to what data? What's the process for deciding that? The seventh category would be the terms of service. So they tend to change these very regularly, and they're very lengthy and hard to follow. So posting more information about what's been changed and how would be helpful. The last category would be around third-party relationships. Who are they already giving data to? What types of data and for what purposes? What rules are in place? I think as a sum total, those categories give us a starting point to be able to guide companies in what we need to know and set a regime that would help us get a deeper understanding of what's even available for research purposes.
If I may, Chris, I would jump in. Also, say simply that I think we can look at the European model because it is a little bit ahead of the other in terms of, for example, a code of practice of misinformation. It's an initiative that has been going on since 2018. And basically, the signatory of this code will need to provide yearly reports to the European Commission showing what steps they are taking to counter disinformation. And I think this allows for refinement of these codes, of the obligations, because every time the European Commission receives this report, identifies, some gaps, some flaws in the mechanism, and requests, a further specification or adjustments. I think this is likely to be the model that we are looking at going forward. So a more sort of a bespoke type of regulation, which goes into the specificity of each platform, while the general obligations remain the same for at least a category of platforms that we can identify, like the very large online platforms in the Digital Services Act or the covered platforms in several US bills. But I think that's indeed the way to improve performance. Identify the targets and then see year after year how the companies are improving at doing that.
Thanks so much, Nicolo. I think all of you have pointed to the need for there to be ongoing dialogue between regulators and companies and other stakeholders about what information we need to be measuring on an ongoing basis and what meaningful transparency looks like. And Alicia, I think you helpfully demonstrated that perhaps there's a lot more we can already call for than we might realize, even without that sort of enhanced tier of researcher access that I think is also a component of various proposals. One more question I would ask before we look to closing is, I think, Nicolo laid out some of the sort of different trade-offs you have to consider in potentially regulating for transparency. And I think one thing that we as the ACT will want to continue to work on and have discussions about is this balance between fragmentation, because I think that's a complaint that you hear as a lot of these different reporting requirements emerge. You hear about the potential for really fragmented requirements that are difficult to implement, and maintaining sufficient flexibility that account for different business models that they'll need to implement some of the reporting requirements. So I think that's just one thing I would also like to hear folks' thoughts on is where do we look for guidance? How do we promote the right international norms that ensure that companies are not then getting a bunch of different competing obligations that kind of lead to less meaningful transparency or transparency for transparency's sake without really having clear measurement goals. I'd be happy to hear any of your thoughts on that sort of balance as well.
Chris, I can jump in if you want. I think this is where mapping really becomes very important. Not just mapping of existing legislation or regulation that's coming down the pipes, but also other means by which companies are being engaged and asked to share information, like the Code on Disinformation that the EU runs. There are multiple different fora through which, in particular, governments are engaging platforms and asking them for information. we often don't have great transparency outside of that. So the civil society and academic world isn't necessarily aware how they're being asked and what they're being asked. So I think a good mapping exercise to be able to understand where they're being asked for information, what kinds of information, how that process works. Is it duplicative? Can we actually reduce the burden there? And then building that out, looking at the regulations, and then trying to find ways in which they can be harmonized such that, you know, companies aren't getting 100 different requests through 100 different laws on what they need to provide. So this is where I think having a model like ACT can really, you know, maybe start to deconflict and understand what those requests are like and where they're coming from. But also if we can engage with policymakers to be able to help better inform the regulation that's currently under development and the different ways in which they are asking companies for information, we might be able to standardize and create greater efficiency.
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous suggestion, and I think if that's something that the Act can achieve, then it will have made a massive contribution. It also, I think, emphasizes the need for a dynamic global community to come together on this, because it's extremely difficult to respond and collate all of the regulatory asks that are being made in every jurisdiction in the world, every region in the world. And if you take a single government, there could be, we all know governments are exceptionally siloed in the way they operate. They won't know what each other are doing, and they're going to be asking for things. And just one single government could be asking half a dozen or more different requests of the companies, and that's just in one place. So really trying to build this environment where the global stakeholders in this region across policy, civil society, government, and the companies are able to feed all their information into one repository that the Act can produce and put out would be an enormous contribution, I think.
I think that...
If I may...
Yeah, please. Don't want to...
Sorry, just from the Christchurch Call perspective, we have a particular focus on government alongside company transparency, and it's a piece of work that we want to do around really looking at what good practice would look like around government transparency, what governments are asking of platforms in terms of data access and content moderation decisions, and what the outcomes of those requests are. And I mentioned our first report in that regard, but you know, it has limitations in and of itself, because that report is just a view of one agency within the New Zealand government rather than a whole of New Zealand government view. There may be requests going from our police or other agencies as well. So look, we're going to work on improving that over time, and with the Call community trying to build that best practice for government around government transparency too.
So to conclude the round of answers, I think that it's a challenging question, and I'm not even sure that the goal should be to have complete uniformity, because in different jurisdictions you have different sensitivities. We can, first of all, look at what is already out there. So in terms of government requests, for example, the Internet Jurisdiction Project has been for a number of years trying to provide the template for this request. In terms of access for researchers, I think that's a completely new area. Perhaps something like CERN, you know, as Alicia was mentioning, or in an international research organization that sets the template for what's need to be looked at in terms of procedures, not so much of substance. Then the substance will be probably evaluated, taking into account, for example, the privacy legislation, research ethics of different cultures. But yes, indeed, we can try to suggest some procedural steps that are common, and making sure that the whole community is consulted before you formalize these codes. I think these are both important steps to be taken.
Thanks so much, Nicolo, and everyone. And I'm also wearing my G&I hat with our focus on that interface between governments and ICT companies. Would like to commend the effort by New Zealand government and the transparency report and trying to model good practices in that area, because I think an important component of getting that sort of as we've discussed a little bit, a lot of this, transparency reporting emerge out of that government company nexus. And I think building those barriers and showing good practices for governments to model to this space really helps bring all stakeholders to the table in a productive way. I think that's left us with a nice point to close it. I think it's clear from today's conversation that there's a lot of work and thinking going on already on what meaningful transparency means, what good practice looks like for companies themselves and for regulators that are implementing requirements in this space. But at the same time, there may be instances where they're not talking to one another in the way that they can, or maybe not always the right experts in the room present. And I think it's clear that the work's laid out for us as the Action Coalition on Meaningful Transparency to really serve as a bridge among these different areas. I think it's also, we've seen today that there are some really specific niche questions that need that level of academic and other in-depth expertise to answer, but just mapping those out and knowing what they are is also essential for getting good recommendations out there in this space. And I think another key takeaway I've seen is even where regulation has emerged, it still kicks a lot down the road in practice, and these sort of multi-stakeholder dialogue will be essential to inform good enforcement in practice, and any effective regulation will have some component of ongoing revision and public input and adapting to changing needs and threats and technologies over time. So with that, I would like to really thank all of my panelists and UNESCO for hosting us. I think this has been a really informative conversation for us in the ACT to take some of this work forward. And I would also just like to say, for those of you in the audience today, that we really encourage participation. So please do reach out to Brainbox and the Global Network Initiative if you're interested in getting involved in this work. Thank you so much, everyone, and I really appreciate it.